Professor Eric Cline. It is a great honour to talk to you. I've read a load of your books over the years. I've listened to your Great Courses Plus lectures. And it's quite surreal to be speaking to you now. I mean, if anybody doesn't know Eric Cline, this is one of his books, Great History of Archaeology in General. But most famously, this book, 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed. I've spoken to archaeologists who are jealous of you, Eric, for writing this book. They say, Eric Cline, I wish I'd written that book. Because this is was it a bestseller? Was it a bestseller?
I guess. I mean, I don't know what the definition of a bestseller is, but
I feel like it's got to be as bestseller as archaeology gets, I would think.
I think so. I mean, it's been translated now into 21 languages. I mean, but who would have guessed? I mean, I never thought that a book on the late Bronze Age collapse would be of interest to more than, I don't know, a dozen people in the world. And lo and behold, but I think it struck a nerve because of what was happening before the pandemic. And then during the pandemic, I think the way I say is, look, lightning struck. I got lucky. But
But there's definitely something in it. There's something compelling in that sort of the rise and fall of civilizations, you know, there's unfortunately there's a sense that I feel like we're heading towards a bit of a precipice.
Yeah, that is a bit unfortunate, isn't it? And yet it makes the ancient past relevant. So I think the secret with that book is I was telling stories about the period that I love, you know, and my students say when we're reading it, we can hear your voice because it's my classroom lectures is what that book is. So anyway, who knew?
And I mean, and having listened to and loved your Great Courses Plus lectures, I sort of read it in your voice as well, which is great.
Oh, well, sorry about that, but
no, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. And you know, hopefully, if we've got time today, also we will talk about your latest. I think it's your latest book, which is after 1177 BC. Really interesting. I mean, this is what comes after the Bronze Age collapse, which I think is often forgotten about, really. We just assume it's a dark age and that's it.
Yeah, exactly. But, that's the sequel. And it's, you know, what do you do if your society has collapsed? And we've actually got like 8 case studies as to how they came back, how they didn't come back. And unfortunately, I would say that's even more relevant today. You know, so it's like, yeah.
Absolutely. And it's not all doom and gloom. There's some...
Just mostly.
Mostly. There are, you know, as we'll talk about, there are some interesting cases of continuity and not everything falling apart. Most things falling apart, but not everything. Yeah. So, Eric, you have... 30, 40 years of excavating under your belt? You've dug at...
Don't tell anybody. Yes.
30,
yes.
I think 30 sites or more than 30 sites.
Well, 30 seasons. I mean,
30 seasons. Okay.
I started... The first excavation I went on was I was a sophomore in college, so I was 18, 19. And have gone almost every year since then. So it used to be that I picked a country I hadn't been to before and found a dig and went early, stayed late, and traveled through the country. And then as time went on, I picked sites that were more in my expertise and interest. So, I think I've been on 30 seasons would be the way to put it. Because, you know, an excavation season, a survey season can be 3 weeks or it could be 3 months or, you know, it could be a year, depending. Yeah, so I think about 30, but, you know, gosh, it's, don't even want to know how old I am right now, but
we won't talk about that.
No, we won't talk about that. But basically, since college, I've gone almost every year on some sort of archaeological expedition. Yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. And I read that I think you dug at Tel Megiddo for quite a long time, and that's always been an interesting site because of the link with Armageddon and the Battle of Tel Megiddo in the between the Canaanites and the Egyptians. When was it? Around about 1400 something BC.
Yeah, it depends BC. On when you want to date it, but yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's Tutmosis III and the Canaanites. You know, 1450, somewhere like that BC. Yeah, I was there for 20 years, 1994 to 2014. Started out volunteer, worked my way up to co-director. So we went every other year. So I brought my kids, and, you know, they're T-shirts cut down to little infant size saying, "I survived Armageddon." but, but yeah, it's a fascinating site. And one of the books I wrote is on the Chicago excavations there in the 1920s and 30s. And I had access to the journals, the diaries, the cables, the letters, including all the stuff where they said, this is not for public consumption, top secret. And I'm like, sorry, dudes, it's 100 years later. This is now for public consumption. So, yeah, so Megiddo was really interesting. And that was a case where I basically said, I'm tired of digging at sites that nobody's ever heard of. And I have to explain at dinner parties where, X site is. I'm like, let me go to a site where everybody's eyes open up wide. Oh, my word. And so since Megiddo is biblical Armageddon, when people would say, so where are you going this summer? I'm like, Armageddon. They're like, Armageddon's not a real place. And I'm like, yes, it is. Anyway, so that was a lot of fun. Plus, archaeologically speaking, there's 20 cities, one on top of another, with really complex stratigraphy. So, digging there was real archaeology. It was really interesting. And they're still making great finds every summer, even though I'm not there anymore.
So, did you find any evidence of the battle at Tel Megiddo?
The famous one with Tutmosis III? No, not per se. What we did at one point was get down to the level, to the stratigraphic level of the battle, and found evidence of mud brick walls and fortifications and things like that. But no, because the battle itself, and if we can believe Tutmosis III, the battle itself was fought down in the valley, outside the city, and he tells us that they managed to close the gates, and he had to besiege the city anywhere between 1 month and 7 months. It depends on how you translate it. And then they captured the city. But even then, I don't think he destroyed the city, because he then takes it over and takes the tribute every year. So I'd actually be surprised if we had found evidence of destruction, because I don't think that's what happened. But we definitely were able to get to that level. But I think we need to do battlefield archaeology in the valley below. And I've actually advocated that. We'd have to find a particular place. But, there's been 34 battles fought in and around Megiddo over the last 4,000 years. So, yeah, I was back in 2000, I put out a book called The Battles of Armageddon. And I think if you go down into the valley and start excavating, you'll find everything from Tutmosis III's battle to Allenby in World War I. I mean, everything's there. You'll have Crusaders, Mamelukes, you name it, you're going to find it. So, but it'll be in the valley outside the mound.
So much history in one place. So much history.
Yeah.
I think that is, part of the reason why this late Bronze Age era is so compelling. You've got the biblical side of things going on. You've got the ancient Egyptians. You've got the you name it, Assyrians, Babylonians. It's all there. It's all there.
Yeah, it's absolutely all there. And that's why it fascinates me, because you've got this interconnected world. You've got the trade. You've got the politics. I mean, that's how I originally got into this. When I was an undergraduate, I was majoring in classical archaeology, but within that, I said, let me do Bronze Age, and so was focused on Greece. But I was thinking even then, wait, I don't want to do Greece in isolation. I'm sure they're in contact with Egypt and the Near East during the Bronze Age, so let me take a look at what's happening there. So after I got the undergraduate degree in classical archaeology, I got the master's in Near Eastern archaeology to try to get the other side of things. And then deliberately went into an ancient history PhD program with Jim Muley, who does both sides of the thing. And he said, what do you want to do when I got to Penn? And I said, I want to study the international trade and connections back then. And he's like, all right, you've come to the right place. And so that's what I've been doing ever since. It's always been my interest, because I've never thought that you can look at one culture in isolation, because they were not in isolation back then. They were interacting with everybody else. So I tend to want to see the whole picture, and that includes both growth and destruction. So, that's where you get the high points of the late Bronze Age with Mycenae and the shaft graves and all of that. And then you get, I guess, what you would call the low points, where everything gets destroyed. So, but I've always liked, the full picture. And at a site like Megiddo, where you've got the comings and goings and diplomacy and battles, there's something for everybody at a site like that.
Absolutely. I think all of that really comes through in your work as well. It's wide-ranging geographically, which is really nice. Aside from that, what is it about this late Bronze Age period that's so compelling? I mean, I see it as kind of an era of firsts a little bit. What do you think to that? I mean, there's sort of a lot of things happening for the first time.
Yeah, I would agree. And then in the ensuing Iron Age, you get a lot of other firsts, like standardization of the alphabet, iron coming in. But the late Bronze Age, I don't know. It's one of these things where, I absolutely love it. But if somebody says, why do you love it? I basically would say, I don't know. I just do. Right. It holds the fascination. I mean, I took a class from Jerry Rutter my freshman fall on Bronze Age Aegean, and I was pre-med at the time. I was supposed to be a doctor, but I was but I had decided back when I was 7 years old that I wanted to be an archaeologist. So I don't know if I told that story in Three Stones Make a Wall or not.
I think it's in there. I think it's in there, yeah.
Yeah, my mom gave me a book on Troy and Heinrich Schliemann, and I read it and said, I'm going to be an archaeologist. And, my mother said, good for you. And my dad's like, well, maybe you should be a doctor. And I'm like, I'll tell you what, I'll major in archaeology, then I'll go to med school. And then I got to college, started, majoring in archaeology, took the class on Bronze Age Aegean, and just said, no, I'm going to be an archaeologist. This is it. So I've always been fascinated, and I find it, I guess you wouldn't say ironic, but maybe telling that the book I read at age 7 was about the Bronze Age and Troy and the Trojan War. I'm like, so basically I've been doing this all my life, and it's like coming up on 6 decades, so I guess, this is what I was meant to do. And like, as you say, hopefully it comes through in my writing, because this is what I love. This is what I do. This is what I am. And now I'm at the point where I want to tell the stories about it and get other people interested and show them why I love it. So unintentionally, I think I've become a storyteller, but based on facts, right? So here, sit down, everybody, around the campfire, and let me tell you about the Trojan War, right? Or whatever. So that's what drives me, and hopefully it comes through.
It definitely comes through, and yeah, I think it's very important in this day and age. The storytelling of archaeology, the intersection of sort of academia with the popular world, I think, is very important at the moment.
Yeah. I would agree, especially, given the internet and everything, the amount of nonsense that is just out there, by people who have a little knowledge is very dangerous. And
that's right.
So
you fill in the gaps with what you do. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. So I've told my colleagues that we really owe it to ourselves, to the field, to the world, to get out there with real stuff and tell everybody, okay, this is real archaeology talking. But then you have to figure out how to communicate to the public. Right. But, all the great archaeologists back then, they did it. I mean, V. Gordon Childe and James Breasted and all that, they wrote for the public as well as for their colleagues. And
yep, that's right.
We need to do that still. Yeah.
That's right. Okay. 1350 BC. I'm going to throw a date out there. 1350 BC. What's happening? And sort of, I mean, how far could you travel in 1350 BC relatively unhindered?
Well, it depends on where in the world you were, of course. But
we're going to focus on the Near Eastern area, so the Eastern Mediterranean.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I thought we might.
You know the deal.
Right, exactly, right. So we're in the Levant, we're in the ancient Near East. So let's say, well, for argument's sake, you could say from the Western Mediterranean, like Italy, Sicily, Sardinia today, to the Eastern Mediterranean beyond Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, basically, and from Turkey down to Egypt, that area, I would say. And 1350 BC, you say. That's an interesting date to choose, and actually quite fortunate, because that would be in the middle of the Amarna period. That would be the New Kingdom period in Egypt. You've got Akhenaten on the throne of Egypt, the heretic pharaoh. You've got his father, Amenhotep III, who had contacts, I think, with Greece as well as everybody else. But you've also got the Amarna letters. You've got the royal archive of Amenhotep and Akhenaten at that time. And it just so happens that is the newest book that just came out, Love, War, and Diplomacy. And I wrote about the discovery of the Amarna letters in 1887 and the world that they depicted that, in 1887, we knew nothing about it. You've got diplomatic letters. You've got 400 letters, almost, 50 between the great kings. You've got King of the Hittites, King of Assyria, King of Babylonia, King of Cyprus, and then the two pharaohs, Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten. And we get a picture of the diplomacy. We get a picture of the dynastic marriages. We know what's going on at the top levels, let's put it that way, in about 1350 BC, including there's 50 of those great letters, and then there's about 300 from the vassal kings in the Levant. So think today, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Palestinian territories, and their letters to and from places that are still around. King of Jerusalem, King of Akko, King of Beirut, King of Tyre, and all of that. So you ask, like, how far could you travel and all that? We actually know because they're sending their messengers back and forth with letters and things written on clay tablets and bringing back caravans of gifts and of dowries and bringing back the brides, because if they're signing a mutual defense treaty, they're cementing it by marrying a daughter, right? So they become related that way. But not everybody knew how far it was. My favorite of those letters is one of the kings, I think it's the king of Babylon, says to the Egyptian pharaoh, I was sick. I've been ill. And you never even asked how I was feeling. And so I'm hurt. I'm upset. Why? Why didn't you ask me? And then there's kind of a pause in the letter. He's like, almost, hold on a second. And he's like, I've just spoken to your messenger. It turns out you're quite far away from me. And so you might not have heard that I was sick, in which case I forgive you. And you're like, wait a minute. And so we once had a student who tried to map it out. How long would it take for a messenger to get from, say, Amarna in Egypt, which is like halfway between Cairo and Luxor today, all the way to Babylonia or Assyria or up to the Hittites and such? But there again, it depends. Are they on foot? Are they on donkey? Are they on camel? Are they sailing for part of the way? But I would say, it's exactly what you would think, common sense. It's a couple weeks to a couple months, whatever, getting there. But then on the opposite end, they would keep the messenger for years. And some of the letters are like, excuse me, could you please send my messenger back? You've had him for 3 years. I would like him back. And you're like, okay, that's fine. So
it's got to be expensive to train somebody to write cuneiform.
Yes, exactly. And some of the scribes were obviously bilingual or even trilingual, because the lingua franca, the diplomatic language at the time, was Akkadian, and as you just mentioned, it's cuneiform, the writing system that you're using. But the Egyptians are doing that, so you have scribes that would know Egyptian, hieroglyphs, hieratic, but they would also know Akkadian and cuneiform, and Hittite as well. And so you're going to have these bilingual, trilingual scribes. And we do have some of the letters, a couple from the king up on the western coast of Turkey, just south of Troy, Arzawa or Arzawa. And the scribe actually, the one scribe writes to the other scribe. There's a whole letter where he says, say to the king, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then at the bottom, he's like, hi, it's me, Fred, it's Joe. Can you always write in Hittite, please? Always write in Hittite. You're like, oh, okay, that's fine. So we have these things that are added.
Are they
at
from
the
Hattusha archive?
No, the two that I'm talking about are in the Amarna archive. But
wow.
But we
Amazing.
do have other things in the archives of the Hittites at Hattusas. Yeah, yeah. So, but we don't have that many archives from this period. We've got the one in Egypt from Amarna, and we've got the one or the couple that are at the capital city, the Hittites, that you just mentioned. And then there's a couple at Ugarit, the international port city in what's now North Syria. And then a little bit earlier and further inland, we've got the Mari archives from about 1800 BC. But it's a limited number of archives that each of them shed light on a different era and a different area. But, between them, that's how we're able to write the history of this period from the viewpoint of the 1%, the names of the kings, the names of the queens, the treaties they do. Yeah. We don't get, the 99%, what did the farmer out in the countryside do? But, you have to have some kind of framework and backbone to put it all together.
Totally.
Yeah, and that's where the archives obviously give us that info.
It's funny you say 1%. I always think of it as the 0.001% because it's just such a tiny proportion of people who are able to send these messages to each other and
yes.
cross. I mean, they're sending emails to each other basically that take years, but
it's very slow internet. Yes,
yeah,
very slow.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
Right. But yes, you're right. It's 1% at the most. But, that was probably the literacy rate back then. At most, 1% could read or write. And, even the kings and queens probably couldn't because these tablets, these letters, it says, say to Amenhotep, thus says Tushratta. And that's the scribe. One scribe to the other says, say to your king, thus says my king. And then he reads out the letter, which of course infers that the king himself is not picking it up and going, dear Tushratta, So I think even the kings and queens probably couldn't read.
They're having it read out to them, yeah. I mean, to be honest, in the Middle Ages, in the early Middle Ages, no kings were literate up until, the 9th, 10th centuries. They all had people to do it for them. That was part of being a king.
Yeah, and even later in the in the Iron Age, where we have people like Ashurbanipal and others, Neo-Assyrians, who started the famous library of Ashurbanipal and such, where basically his inscriptions say, I can read and write. I didn't think I was going to become king, and I'm able to read or write. And he's saying that because he's very proud of being able to do it, and it must have been very unusual. So.
It was unusual.
Yeah.
So life is quite interconnected for these 1%ers. I mean, is it interconnected for the average person, or is it sort of?
I would say
depends who you are.
Depends who you are and what you're doing. The average person, the average. I don't know, leather crafter, sword maker. No, it wasn't. They probably never really left home. But the merchants that are traveling between the cities, it's interconnected. The diplomats, it's interconnected. And that is, again, one of the reasons why I like this period is the interconnections between the G8, as I call them, the great kings. They're a small world network. Everybody is either directly connected or connected via somebody else, so that you can get from one power to any other power in 3 hops or less. So like you've got a direct contact between Mycenaeans and Hittites. You probably don't have a direct connection between Mycenaeans and Assyrians. But the Hittites are in contact with the Assyrians. So you can go Mycenae, Hittites, Assyrians, and that's, indirect, but it's 2 hops, right? And you can do that for any of these. And the definition of a small world network is when you have a closed group like this and nobody is more than 3 hops from anybody else. So, why is that important? Because small world networks don't happen that often in history. Us today, obviously, the entire world is a small world network. And then back in the late Bronze Age, also a small world network in terms of the great powers. And so I frequently tell my audiences that's why it matters what happened to them, because they're actually more closely related to us today than you might suspect. And so what happened to them when they collapsed should probably be of a bit of a concern to us. But, I start out 1177 BC, the book, saying they had what we had. They had amazing marriages. They had monumental divorces. They had wars. They had treaties. They had embassies. They had embargoes. They had pretty much everything that we have. I mean, think of the royal weddings that you guys have over in the UK, right? They had those royal weddings back then as well.
Yeah, they would have put ours to shame, I think.
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. But, they had the same famines and droughts and pestilences that we've got. And that's why I look around today. And when I give my lectures to public audiences now I usually give a combination lecture called 1177 BC and After, the collapse and survival of. And I just say, are we in the same situation that we've got? That they had back then. And I say, yeah, they had famines, we have famines. They had droughts, we have droughts. They had pestilence, we just had COVID. They had, and I just keep naming them. And we've got things that they didn't have. Like, you remember the financial collapse of 2008 that hit Wall Street. Well, they didn't really have that back then. But they did have supply chain shortages, just like we have today. You remember that ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal, right, for 6 days? Then we couldn't have any toilet paper and such. Well, they had it back then, too. I imagine to some degree that the trade routes bringing tin got cut during the collapse. And you don't have tin, you can't make bronze. So I basically say we have the same situation today that they had back then, and they collapsed. And to say that we are too big to fail, I say it's just hubristic. The big question, of course, and I always get this, somebody raises their hand and say, what do you mean by we? Who's the we that's going to collapse? And I'm like, well, the United States and Europe for sure, but then how far does that spread? Also Southeast Asia, Australia. I don't know. We're so interconnected that it could be global. And that's what we had with COVID. It was a global pandemic. Financial crisis in 2008 was, could have gone global very easily. And the one thing I keep thinking about, and I don't know if I'm right about this, but what if hypothetically the financial collapse had happened a dozen years later? What if it had happened in, say, 2020 instead of 2008, and it happened at about the same time as COVID? I don't think you and I would be sitting here talking if we did, because that's kind of my rule of thumb. You can survive one thing. You might not survive 2, and you're definitely not going to survive 3 or 4 if they happen at the same time, and you can't recover from one before you've got the other. So if we had had COVID raging and Wall Street collapsed, that's a recipe for disaster. And pretty much every society in humanity has collapsed at some point or transformed totally. So I'm not optimistic about the future, my friend. This is a problem.
Yeah, I know. It's depressing, isn't it? And I was going to say, throw some natural disasters on there too.
Oh, yeah, let's toss a couple of earthquakes and a couple of hurricanes in there. Yeah. Sure, why not? Yeah.
Absolutely. But, I mean, this takes us on to our next point nicely, because, I mean, we've got this world in 1350 BC where it's pretty connected. Things are going on.
That was a good
Things
that was
are
a good
possible.
time. Yes.
It was a good time. Yeah. Things are kind of flourishing. Think it's a boom time. what goes wrong? What happens?
What
200
goes
years
wrong?
later, it's a mess.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yes, you could ask what goes wrong. I would say what doesn't go wrong. I mean, everything went wrong, and I think it was an accident. I think it was a perfect storm is what I call it. But I also, if you read 1177 carefully, you will notice at one point I say that it was, and I do this with a straight face, it was a series of unfortunate events. Yeah, which is a line straight out of Lemony Snicket, which is what I used to read to my kids when we were little. So it most definitely was a series of unfortunate events, and
Yeah.
they all combined. I think the official name today, people talk about a polycrisis, where you have multiple crises all at the same time. So if I had to put out a new edition of the book, I would probably say, yeah, it's a perfect storm, series of unfortunate events. It's a polycrisis, which,
It's a good name for a book, Polycrisis.
Yeah, polycrisis.
Yeah.
I'm sure
I mean,
somebody
is that the
already...
same as, the same as systems collapse? That's kind of the one, that's the thing that I've heard, systems collapse.
Well, it's not the same thing, but it's what leads to a systems collapse.
It's what leads to a systems
collapse. From
yeah.
the polycrisis, because the systems collapse, which was basically coined by Colin Renfrew in the late 1970s, and it's when you've got your central administration collapses, your central economy collapses, the top 1%, the elite, disappear, die, or migrate. And then you have a dark age that follows. And system collapses happen, well, I wouldn't say frequently, but definitely there was a systems collapse when the Roman Empire fell, even though you still had the Eastern Roman Empire that kept going for 1,000 years. But you have a systems collapse when the Harappan civilization in the Indus Valley collapsed at the beginning of the second millennium BC. Systems collapse when the Maya went down, 900 AD, give or take. So these things have happened. And Renfrew pointed out that it usually takes about 100 years for the collapse to unfold, which is exactly what we've got at the end of the late Bronze Age. You know, the title of the book is clickbait. 1177 is not the year civilization collapsed. It's the year the Sea Peoples invaded for the second time. So it's a benchmark for me. Just like over here in the States, we talk about Rome falling in, 476 AD. It didn't. It took the whole 5th century. And even then, like I said, parts of it continued. But it's a benchmark. It's shorthand. So that's the way I sleep at night. I'm like, 476 is to Rome as 1177 is to late Bronze Age. So, it takes the 12th century BC for all the collapse to happen. But by the end, I said, by 1100 BC, that small world network, the interconnections, is broken. The network is gone. The individual societies, as I talk about in the sequel, they then have to figure out, are we going to adapt? Are we going to cope? Are we going to transform? Or are we going to throw up our hands and, just disappear? So that's where we've got the 8 case studies of what to do, what not to do. But what is for sure, what collapses is the network, the diplomacy, the commerce, all of that. That definitely collapses. And then as part of the systems collapse, when you have that dark age that follows, Renfrew said, you frequently get songs and myths and stories about the era that had just collapsed. So, I give you Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the story of the Trojan War. It's exactly what it is. So when I was, working on the book and looking at the pros and cons of what it, happened, I'm like, was it an earthquake? I'm like, well, yeah. Was it disease? Well, yeah. Was it famine? Yeah. And that was when I thought, you know what? It's all of the above, hence the perfect storm. And then I'm like, wait a minute, we're talking about a systems collapse. That's really what it is. And then for me, everything fell into place. I'm like, okay, that is probably, I think, the best way to explain what happened. But bear in mind, I didn't just pull this out of the blue. This is from years of studying what previous scholars and my colleagues have said. Everything that's in my book is based on the work of others. It takes a village. And so one person said it's this, one person said it's this. And I'm like, how about it's both, right? And so, yeah, but I mean, that's the beauty of archaeology and ancient history. It's everybody working in tandem and suggesting hypotheses. What do you think about this? We're like, yeah, I don't know. How about if we tweak it and this and that? So I, by no means do I expect my books to be the final word. Oh, my word, they're not. What they are is pushing the discussion further. And I fully expect people to tweak it and disagree. And they already have, in academic circles. Well, we disagree with this point, with this point. How about if we do this? Maybe there's not as many destructions as you think. Maybe it's not as complete a collapse. And I'm like, good.
Yeah.
Sure, let's talk about this. Yeah.
This is something I've heard recently. People sort of pushing back a bit and saying it wasn't as bad as you think. I suppose maybe you could let us know a bit of what the archaeology looks like when you're on a site and you see the collapse. What does it look like? I mean, we're talking about less trade goods coming in. Are we talking about actual burn destruction levels?
It depends on the site, but yes. And this is where it's a matter of interpretation also. You look at a destruction of a site, it's obviously by fire, let's say. But one person's interpretation of, the entire site went up, and another one looks and goes, no, the cow kicked the lantern over in the barn and the house went up, So, so there are pushback, which is fine. This is how re-examining the evidence and all of that is fine. But the one thing that I would say for anybody is, what is definite is there's a huge change. Definitely the Bronze Age comes to an end. Definitely the Iron Age comes to an end. If you want to call that a transformation, be my guest. To my mind, it's a collapse because, the crap hit the fan. And the world that came afterward, it's a new world order. And to me, that takes a collapse of the old world order. It's not just hey, we're waking up on a Monday and we're going to transform. It's like, no, bad stuff happened over the weekend and we have to fix it, that kind of thing. So I think, to my mind, we're arguing nuances, degrees. And that's where, like Patricia McEnany and Norm Yaffe once said, if you look at any collapse, Maya, Roman, Harappan, Late Bronze Age, and you look at it too closely, you're going to lose the definition. And they said, take a high-res digital photograph, for instance. From a distance, you can see it's beautiful, right? But if you get right up close, you get lost in the pixelation and you can't see it. And I suggested something similar. Looking at a collapse is like looking at an impressionist painting. Standing halfway across the room, you can see the painting. You know exactly what the picture is. You get right up close, and all you're seeing are little dabs of paint. And that's what it's like looking at the collapse. And so, yeah, you go to any site, and you can say, yes, but, yes, but, yes, but. And then I'm like, yeah, but if you step back, it's definitely a collapse. So, again, this is all fine. But, okay, so to get back to your question, it depends on the site. And
it's the sheer volume of sites.
Yes.
I think is partly what we're talking about. Yeah, because it's the same for the post-Roman period in Britain. People like to say it wasn't that bad, and it's like, well, it's completely different world than the world that came before. There's no urbanism on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
sure, life maybe wasn't so bad for individuals, but it's a different world that they're living in for sure.
It is for sure. And that brings to another point then. Some of my colleagues, and they're quite right about this, they said, it was bad, sure, but for whom? It was bad for the elites, that's for sure.
Yeah,
but was
very
it
bad?
Yeah, but what about, and this is kind of my favorite example, Martin Finet and Eric of Viborg, who study the area around Pylos in southern Greece. And they're like, when Pylos and Mycenae and Tiryns and the other Mycenaean palaces went down, the average peasants, farmer out in Messenia, might have gone, yippee, hooray, now I'm not going to be pulled in to help drain the Copaeus Basin or something,
build someone's massive tomb. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Yeah. Or build the Lion Gate at Mycenae. So, one person's collapse is another person's opportunity, if you will. So
Of course.
I really do think it depends on where you look and at whom you look and when you look. But there are obvious things, like if you look at the site of Ugarit, north coast of Syria, it's burnt to the ground at this time, just after 1200, maybe 1190, 1185 BC at the latest. There are
the culprits are named as well.
Well, they are and they aren't. That's the funny part.
Okay.
Yeah. So when the French excavated Ugarit, there's a meter of destruction, right? And there are arrowheads in the buildings. There are bodies and hordes that nobody ever came back. And now we've got newly translated tablets from one of the archives that was, preserved by the fire that burnt the city. And in one of the newly translated tablets, which just came out in French in 2016, 10 years ago, and it says, the enemy has overrun the port city, and they are now on their way to Ugarit. Please send reinforcements. Well, the reinforcements obviously never got there because the city was not only burnt to the ground, it was abandoned for 400 years. The problem is the scribe, and I could throttle the scribe. He says the enemy. That's all he says is the enemy. Why didn't he say the Peleset, the Shurdan, the Shekelesh, the Equesh? Tell us who it is.
Yes.
Because the Egyptian pharaohs do tell us. I mean, that's where we know about the sea peoples. But Ugarit,
I thought they called them the people from the sea, but that must be somewhere else.
The peoples of the sea, or the sea peoples, that's our name for them. In fact, it was
a French guy, wasn't it, who came up with it?
One of the early French Egyptologists called them the people of the sea. The Egyptians, Nepta and Ramses III, those are the two invasions of the sea peoples in what we would say 1207 BC and 1177 BC. And they actually named them. And some of the ones I just mentioned, the Shekelesh, the Shardana, the Equesh, the Peleset, the Teresh. So there are 9 different groups that make up the sea peoples, and the Egyptians actually named them. What's ironic is some of them were already known. They're mercenaries, like the Shardana or the Shurdan. They had actually fought on the side of the Egyptians, like I think it was at the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites. Yeah. And now here they are.
The horns on their helmets, haven't they? Yeah,
exactly right. Because Ramses III has a picture of them, so so we know these people, but we know them and we don't know them. Right? Where'd they come from? Where'd they go to? This is still one of history's great mysteries. There's never been a site that has been excavated where we could point to it and say that's where one of the groups came from. Right? I presume we're going to find it somewhere. And I think personally, we should be looking Sardinia, Sicily, Italy as the launch point, if you will, for at least some of these sea peoples, because we now know that there was a drought and famine in at least northern Italy at exactly that time. The Terramara culture gets hit at about 1200 BC, and Christian Christensen's and other archaeologists have said there was a mass emigration at that time. I think that's the beginning of the movement of the sea peoples. They go all the way across the Eastern Mediterranean and wind up attacking Egypt, which is where they get recorded. So it's a big deal.
It would make sense. Yeah. It would make sense. Yeah. I know that there were some trade links between Greece and Italy at that point. Just a little bit, across the Adriatic Sea.
Yes.
So you've got to think possibly some pirate ship had a go at someone down there in Messenia.
Exactly. Yeah, my colleagues Louise Hitchcock and Ari Meyer have actually written a lot about whether there was piracy as part of the collapse in the late Bronze Age, which I would agree. Of course there is, and some of the groups like the Luca in the southwestern Anatolia, what is now today Turkey, which becomes later Lycia, the Luca and I think the Lycians as well are known as pirates back then.
That's right.
So so we've definitely got piracy as part of collapse. Sure, and why not? Why not add them into the mix?
to go to a completely different time period in the Viking era. You could be a pirate one week and you could be a trader the next week. So you could have these people just, sometimes you'd put your armor on, other times you wouldn't have the armor on when you go into a port.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
yeah.
But therein, I mean, that leads to another question of what was the nature of the Sea Peoples? Are they like Vikings? And of course, the Vikings, as I've been told by people, the Vikings frequently had the wives and kids with them. It wasn't always just the men, making the raids.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So we've got something similar because Ramses III, in the picture that he has on the wall at Medinet Habu, his mortuary temple in Egypt, he shows women and children, and luggage in ox carts. And it's definitely, this is a migration. It's not just an invasion. So they're moving. What I say in the book, I compare it to the Dust Bowl in the United States, 1930s, where they're moving from Oklahoma to California, for example, because of a drought and famine. And I think that's what we've obviously got in the late Bronze Age. Yeah, so comparison to Vikings, yes, but when the Vikings are moving with their wives and kids would be the way to get the analogy flowing. Yeah.
Super interesting.
Yeah, you can see why I'm interested in this period. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
There's like something for everybody. And then when you toss the stories in, because this collapsed at about 1200, to my thinking, that's where you fit the story of the Trojan War in. That makes sense for it to happen at about that time. That's where you put the Exodus from the Bible. It makes sense that that's about the time when the circumstances were such that you could have had a mass migration out of Egypt. And so I think a lot of the historical stories that we've got, whether they're legendary or not, I think there's a kernel of truth, and I think you can fit them in. But, we were talking about 1350 BC, and that was a good period. Absolutely. If you had to live in the late Bronze Age, I would be back then, 1350 BC. But by 1200, 150 years later, it's all gone. And I think the same things that brought them up to the great levels are also the same things that brought them down. And we frequently see that in history. What powers you on the way up, when it fails, is what brings you down. So I think the interconnectedness and the Mediterranean globalization, which led to this amazing golden age in the late Bronze Age. Interesting that the Bronze Age was also a golden age, but never mind. When that system collapses and you can't get tin or you can't get copper or whatever, and you have supply chain issues, that's what I think contributes to bringing them down. So, same things that brought them up are the things that brought them down. And that's where, again, I see lessons for us today, because we have that same interconnection. And we are today up at those heights of greatness, and we could easily be brought down by those same things.
And we have an over-reliance on things like oil, for example.
Yes.
I mean, it's worth noting that bronze is kind of like it's like the currency of the day, and it's sort of integral at the time for all sorts of things that you needed for society to function. A little bit like the oil today.
Well, and Carol Bell, wonderful archaeologist over there in the UK, she has said that tin in the ancient world is like oil today. And I completely agree. In fact, I quoted her in my book, but I would also now amend it slightly. I would actually say rare earths like lithium that are used to make chips is actually a better analogy now. I mean, look at our overdependence. Again, during the pandemic when we couldn't get chips, there went the computers, there went the cars, there went, and so the over-reliance for sure is a problem. So there are all kinds of analogies. Yeah,
I suppose this is the interesting thing. Yeah, if an individual farmer somewhere after the Bronze Age collapse, life would probably be fine, but they wouldn't have access to something made of bronze. They wouldn't have access to, I don't know, nice jewelry, something like that. There are lots of things they wouldn't have access to anymore. They wouldn't have access to information about the wider world, probably.
Yeah, exactly. And there'd be
much like if ever collapse happens now, it probably would be okay for lots of people, but you wouldn't have a smartphone.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
And you'd have trouble like they did back then getting good wine or good
yeah,
olive oil or
exactly.
perfume or
That's right.
whatever. Yeah. Yeah. And that's the other thing about a systems collapse is in the aftermath, we can see that they go down to a lower level, social, economic, political, and they have to rebuild. And that's exactly what happens in the 400 years after the late Bronze Age collapses. They have to rebuild, especially in a place like Greece, where they go almost down to ground zero. By 1050 BC, you don't have anybody calling themselves a Mycenaean anymore. Nobody calls themselves a Minoan. And yet they're resilient enough, if you will, that by 800 BC, they're back up and running. And then, by 600, 500 BC, you've got democracy. You've got, then the Parthenon in the 5th century and so on. But everybody else, the way I said it in the sequel, it's like running a foot race. Everybody starts at the same starting line, meaning the collapse. But then they all finish at different times, and some don't finish at all. Some make it back and they're resilient, like the Cypriots, like the Phoenicians, like the Assyrians, like the Babylonians. Others, like the Hittites, they go away. They don't survive.
They're gone.
They're
Yeah,
gone.
absolutely.
Don't be a Hittite. Yeah.
But I mean, is it fair to say Egypt survives? Bronze Age Egypt survives, but it sort of lingers on?
Yeah, it does and it doesn't. And in fact, that's where, with 1177 BC, I had the original one in 2014, came out with the revised version in 2021 because there was so much new data. And then the sequel after 1177 came out in 2024, so 10 years after the first book. And one of the things that I did and that I noticed is when I first was writing, I'm like, yes, of all of these, only Egypt really survives, because I had come at it kind of biased. When I really knuckled down and did the research in the Iron Age, which was, out of my specialty because I'm Bronze Age, but when I got up to speed on the Iron Age, I'm like, ooh, Egypt didn't actually do as well as I thought. And they're in the middle of my categories because I had the temerity to rank the 8 societies as who did best and who did worst. And Egypt is dead in the middle.
They get conquered a lot after the Bronze Age.
Yes,
so
but even
lots of outside invasions.
Absolutely, but even just in the aftermath, there's a one. I mean, we're in the 3rd intermediate period in Egypt at that time, and at one point, there's 3 different guys that all say they're king of Egypt at the same time in different parts of Egypt. And to my mind, if you're comparing it to life back at, say, the time of King Tut or Ramses the third, or even Ramses the second, that's not ideal. You should have one king for the entire country of Egypt. But even if you don't, even if you have multiple kings, and again, like in Greece, there was a king at Mycenae, there was a king at Tiryns, a king at Pylos, and they did absolutely fine. But in the aftermath of the collapse in Egypt, they retreat from the world stage. I would not call them a major player during the 3rd intermediate period. Yeah, they have some contacts. They get copper from Jordan and things like that. But, few and far between when you have a guy like Sheshonq, maybe biblical Shishak, who goes up and conquers in Israel and Judea, the 2 new kingdoms of the many up there. But Egypt is not what it was. Not like it was in the late Bronze Age. And it never will be. Like you say, they are then conquered, right? I mean, you've got Nubians, you've got Cushites, you've got Alexander the Great. Before him, you've got Persians.
It's a free-for-all.
It is. Neo-Assyrians come down, Neo-Babylonians, right?
Mm.
Yeah. Who doesn't conquer? And you wind up with, Cleopatra in Egypt and the Romans. And so, yeah. So I would say, and again, I'm kind of biased here, but from the viewpoint of Egypt, the late Bronze Age was their greatest, period. You could take the Old Kingdom and the Fourth Dynasty and the Pyramid Age and make an argument. Sure, that was pretty good too. And they left, a couple of small monumental buildings like the pyramids at Giza, things like that.
Yeah.
But in terms of international trade, yeah, from my point of view, give me the Late Bronze Age, say 1500 to 1200 BC.
And they had gold by that point as well.
Well, that was it.
Nubia.
They had the monopoly on gold because they controlled the mines and the gold sources in Nubia and Sudan at that point. So, yeah. Cyprus controls the copper, Egypt controls the gold, and that's in part how it all worked. That's where they were not self-sufficient and they were dependent upon each other. But, yeah, Egypt, we see in the Amarna letters, to bring this full circle and come back to 1350 BC. The Amarna letters, the kings of Assyria and Babylonia, they all say, gold is like dust in your land, they say to the Egyptian pharaoh. Gold is like dirt. Just send me some. You'll never notice. And in return, says one, I'll send you my daughter. And the Egyptian pharaoh writes back, what kind of a man are you that would give your daughter for a few nuggets of gold? And then there's a pause and he goes, but okay, here's some gold.
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Why not? Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Fascinating. I suppose, just before we get to after the collapse, just briefly, I mean, the tin supply ends.
It doesn't end.
Afghanistan, but also Cornwall recently. Maybe.
Yeah.
The Cornwall link.
I would say it slows to a trickle. Let's put it that way. They're still making bronze in the Iron Age, but the big question is, where does it come from? I think personally that the vast majority of the tin in the Late Bronze Age is coming from what we would call Afghanistan, Central Asia, Badakhshan region, where lapis lazuli comes from also. But there have been, including very recent studies, that, of course, Cornwall would have been another source. I don't think it was as major, but we've got Cornish tin. There were also tin mines in southeastern Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, at the same time. So I think the tin is coming from a number of different sources, but Afghanistan would have been the major one, and we've got for instance, the Mari letters that I mentioned, dating back to 1800 BC, time of Hammurabi, right, the lawgiver, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And we've got one text that describes the route that they're bringing the tin on from Afghanistan to Mari on the Euphrates to Ugarit on the north coast of Syria. And they even say that there are Minoans at Ugarit, and they have to pay the interpreter a certain amount of tin, and then they ship the tin off to Crete, which they call Kaftor. So we can actually see the trade route, but I do think as part of the collapse, those trade routes are cut to a certain extent. And in fact, at one point back decades ago when I was a student, they actually thought that the cutting of the trade routes and the decrease in the supply of tin was what led to the collapse, economically speaking. I do think that wasn't the major thing, but I do think it was one of those unfortunate events. Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of helped. Helped. Just for those of you who are only listening, and also for those of you who are viewing, we've got to draw attention now to Eric's tie, which is Minoan bull leapers.
Yes.
So great tie there.
I suppose from a student, yes.
It's an interesting, so it's a good segue there, because the Minoan Crete around about that time of the bull leapers, it's a real apogee. Things are pretty great at that point, but then 800 years later, well, not even that probably, sometime later after the Bronze Age collapse, plumbing is gone. All these like amazing engineering feats, they're all gone. So let's talk about the time after the Bronze Age collapse now. Sure. Is it all doom and gloom?
Yes.
Okay.
No, it's not. And in fact, in terms of Crete, one archaeologist, Sarah Wallace, has actually said on Crete it was a successful collapse. And I'm like,
okay.
When is a collapse successful? But basically, they navigated the collapse. Yes, you don't have the major palace at Knossos and such anymore, except you do. It turns out that Iron Age Knossos was bigger than we had thought. And that's just, discoveries in the last 5 years or so. But you definitely don't have the Minoans anymore, like I just mentioned. By like 1050 BC at the latest, nobody's saying I'm a Minoan. What they do transition to are the archaic states, the archaic Crete, and you basically get city-states at various places. And they do survive. They are resilient, if you will, but not like the Cypriots or the Phoenicians, I would say. So you do have life continuing on Minoan Crete, and I guess that would be a successful collapse. But in the sequel book, in After 1177, I not only ranked them with 1 being the best and 5 being the worst, but I also I take a page out of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which won a Nobel Prize back in 2007. They're the ones that come out with things on climate change every year. And they also do risk management and mitigation reports and suggestions. And they basically said that when you have an extreme impact event, and the late Bronze Age collapse fits the definition of an extreme impact event, it can be something like Hurricane Katrina hitting New Orleans, but it can also be sustained drought and things like that. So I actually once asked somebody who was a member of the IPCC, I described the late Bronze Age collapse and said, would it fit your definition of an extreme impact event? He said, yeah, absolutely. I said, good, because then you say there are 3 ways to deal with that in the aftermath. One is coping, where you're just trying to get to tomorrow. Another is adapting, where you're trying to get to a month out, 2 months out. You're adapting to the new normal. But the best possible way is to transform, to say something like, that can never happen again. We can't ever allow New Orleans to flood again because of a hurricane. I was just in New Orleans 2 weeks ago, so I agree. We can't ever let it be flooded again, like Katrina. And so that's where I ranked the societies. Did they just cope? Did they adapt? Did they, transform? And I would say the Cypriots and the Phoenicians transformed, because the Cypriots are the ones that are at the forefront of changing from bronze to iron. They're the ones, it looks like, are responsible as the first. Then they spread the technology. The Phoenicians, of course, well, they don't invent the alphabet, but they do standardize it. Same thing with purple dye. They don't invent purple dye, but they do standardize its manufacture. And then both the Cypriots and the Phoenicians become what Nassim Nicholas Taleb calls anti-fragile. He's got a book called that, Anti-Fragile. Things that flourish in an age of chaos. And if you take advantage of chaos and turn it to your benefit, you are anti-fragile. And that's my number 1 category. And I would say both the Phoenicians and the Cypriots fit that, with the invention of iron and the standardization of the alphabet. And that's why at the end of the sequel, I make a pitch. I said, you know what? This isn't actually a dark age. I know everybody calls it that, but as John Papadopoulos at UCLA and others have said, any era in which you suddenly have the invention of iron and the standardization of the alphabet, that's not a dark age. That's an era of resilience. And if you look on the adaptive cycle, after a collapse, you always have a period of innovation and invention as they come back to life. And I think that's exactly what we've got. But the Minoans are not quite as good. The Minoans on my scale and the Mycenaeans are down in group 4. They're not as bad as the Hittites, but they're worse than the Egyptians, because they have to start from ground zero. But a caveat, and I'll end here, the caveat is that the break between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, which we've always kind of thought was, immutable, and there were people like me who studied the Bronze Age, and other people that studied the Iron Age, and never the twain shall talk, let alone meet. We're now talking across that border. And it's pretty obvious that I describe it as a porous membrane rather than as an iron curtain, which is the way we used to look at it, because we do have things that get through. Take, for instance, religion. We know in the Linear B tablets of the Mycenaeans, which are mostly accounting tablets, how many chariot wheels came out, how much bronze came in. They do name the gods and goddesses, and we know that the Mycenaeans were worshiping Zeus and Hera and Athena and Aphrodite and Poseidon. And of course, those are the gods of later archaic and classical Greece. So obviously they made it through that barrier between the Bronze and the Iron Age. And we see that elsewhere also. The religion often makes it through. Assyrians, Babylonians.
Or Egypt.
And Egypt, sure. Absolutely. So I said, look, as we're talking about this, I said, let's look at this as a porous membrane, even for the places that get hit the worst. And, to be fair, even the Hittites themselves, who completely go down, we don't have any Hittites per se in central Anatolia after the late Bronze Age collapse. There, new groups come in, the Phrygians, the Urartians. But even then, you have some survival. And I'm thinking here of North Syria, where we have what we call the Neo-Hittites, the new Hittites. And they continue on at sites like Carchemish and Aleppo. And they are still using Hittite royal names, Shupi-Luliuma, things like that. They are still writing using Alluvian, which was, used for royal inscriptions. They still have the Hittite gods and goddesses. So the Hittites themselves may be gone, but the Neo-Hittites survive. And so I actually put them up in a separate category. Hittites are down in category 5. Neo-Hittites are back in category 2. And by the way, I think those are the Hittites that we find in the Bible. I think by the time the Bible is written and they're talking about Hittites,
that makes sense.
The late Bronze Age Hittites are gone, but the new Hittites, the Neo-Hittites in North Syria, those are the ones the biblical writers would have known about because they would have come into contact with the Israelites and all that. So
they're in the right region for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So anyway, I do think, and this is why in the sequel I say, and as I've said here before, we've got 8 case studies of what to do and what not to do in the event your society collapses. And towards the end of the book, I have a little table of 7 common sense lessons to be learned from the collapse, and that I think we should, be following. And they are common sense. They're like, try and be self-sufficient if you can, but don't be isolationist. Do lean on your neighbor if you can. What else? Water everywhere. Water is going to be incredibly important for us, and it was incredibly important back then. I mean, you think out of the G8, you actually had the G top 4, right? The Egyptians, Hittites, Assyrians, Babylonians. And the Assyrians and Babylonians and Egyptians, they do okay, like I've said, category 2, category 3. They had the Nile, they had the Tigris, they had Euphrates. The only one that wasn't on a major water source were the Hittites, and those are the only one of the 4 that actually go away. So water is going to be important. And then the main thing I really do say is, look, we've got a problem with weather conditions now, extreme weather conditions. I don't think you can argue against that. So I say you need to prepare for extreme weather, because if it happens, hopefully you're prepared. And if it doesn't happen, what have you lost? So, I end my lecture these days, the lecture I'm giving on the sequel, by putting up a picture of John Wooden, the famous basketball coach of the UCLA Bruins, whom I got to see coach in his last 2 years. I was all of 10 years old, but, his team had an 88 win streak at one point where they didn't lose in like 2 years. And he used to tell, it was absolutely amazing. It'll never be replicated. And he used to tell his teams, by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. And I
Right.
think today we are failing to prepare, which means we're preparing to fail, which is really bad. And then I get so pessimistic. I'm like, I'm like Cassandra running around when nobody's listening to me, or Chicken Little, the sky is falling. Because I point to Mark Twain and say, look, he supposedly said, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme, and we're definitely rhyming right now. So
absolutely.
So
I mean, I look in depth into the fall of the Roman Empire as well, so it's like you can see the similarities many times through history.
Right.
It's the closing down of libraries and things like this, and defunding of museums and removal of culture, which sort of worries me because that was going on back then.
And you're quite right, and this is why it almost feels to me as if we're moving faster and faster and faster, heading toward the cliff. And with the libraries and the museums and, over here.
And individuals seem to be losing knowledge of how to fix things and how to make things, and everything's being automated, but then, no one knows how to do anything anymore.
Exactly. The big question for me is, when are we going to get to the tipping point? And what is going to be the tipping point? What is going to make us go off the cliff? And we're like, right now we're running at full speed towards the edge of the cliff with no brakes in sight. So, my books in part, I hadn't officially originally meant it this way, but I really do hope that the people in power are reading these and are going, hey, wait, that sounds like us today. And I'm like, yeah, over here. Hello. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, we should be learning from history. We should be learning from archaeology.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
And we should be anti-fragile, as you say.
Absolutely.
I channel the Phoenicians.
Exactly. Channel the Phoenicians, not the Mycenaeans, and definitely not the Hittites. Don't be a Hittite.
Not the Hittites.
No.
Never be a Hittite.
Never be a Hittite. No.
Well, I think that's a good point to end it. That's been absolutely fascinating, Eric. Thank you so much for coming on. Everybody
pleasure.
Check out Eric's books. That's the big one. That's another one. That's another one. And I gather you've just written another book as well.
Yeah, Love, War, and Diplomacy, if you want to know all about the Amarna letters. But fair warning, we get down in the weeds. You will find out more than you ever wanted to know about the academic infighting. But it's fascinating because you've got two British scholars, famous ones, Wallace Budge and A.H. Sayce, an Assyriologist and an Egyptologist, racing to decipher the Amarna letters. And then you've got 5 German scholars, whom I call the Young Berliners. And so I interweave the story of the race to translate from the cuneiform and Akkadian with what we learned about the late Bronze Age. So I've got the royal letters in there and the vassal letters. Anyway, I had a lot of fun writing it, and I'm hoping people have fun reading it. So
it's riveting. It's riveting stuff. The whole history of archaeology is fascinating.
It really is. Yeah. It's a story within a story, but I'm so grateful to you for having me on. It's so much fun just to be able to talk about this stuff.
Well, thanks for coming on. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we could talk all day. We were saying earlier we could talk for an hour just on Minoan bull leaping. But, we've got to try.
We didn't even get to that. We didn't even talk about Minoan bull leaping. Yeah.
We'll have to do it another time.
Next time.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Eric. Everybody buys books. Cheers, everybody.
Thanks.
That's it from us.